Lecture 6, On Training. He was always earnestly urging those who were associated with him to make practical application of his teachings, using some such arguments as the following. Virtue, he said, is not simply theoretical knowledge, but its practical application as well, just like the arts of medicine and music. Therefore, as the physician and the musician not only master the theoretical side of their respective arts, but must also train themselves to act according to their principles. So a man who wishes to become good not only must be thoroughly familiar with the precepts which are conducive to virtue, but must also be earnest and zealous in applying those principles. How indeed could a person immediately become temperate if he only knew that one must not be overcome by pleasures, but was quite unpractised in withstanding pleasures? How could one become just when he had learned that one must love fairness, but had never exercised himself in avoidance of selfishness and greed? How could we acquire courage if we had merely learned that the things which seem dreadful to the average person are not to be feared, but had no experience in showing courage in the face of such things? How could we become prudent if we had come to recognize what things are truly good and what evil, but had never had practice in despising things which only seem good? Therefore, upon learning of the lessons appropriate to each and every excellence, practical training must follow invariably, if indeed from the lessons we've learned we hope to derive any benefit. And moreover, such practical exercise is the more important for the student of philosophy than for the student of medicine or any similar art. The more philosophy claims to be a greater and more difficult discipline than any other study. The reason for this is that men who enter the other professions have not had their souls corrupted beforehand, and have not learned the opposite of what they are going to be taught. But the ones who start out to study philosophy have been born and reared in an environment filled with corruption and evil, and therefore turn to virtue in such a state that they need a longer and more thorough training. How then, and in what manner, should they receive such training? Since it so happens that the human being is not soul alone, nor body alone, but a kind of synthesis of the two, the person in training must take care of both, the better part, the soul, more zealously, as is fitting, but also of the other, if he shall not be found lacking in any part that constitutes man. For obviously the philosopher's body should be well prepared for physical activity, because often the virtues make use of this as a necessary instrument for the affairs of life. Now there are two kinds of training, one which is appropriate for the soul alone, and the other which is common to both soul and body. We use the training common to both when we discipline ourselves to cold, heat, thirst, hunger, meagre rations, hard beds, avoidance of pleasures, and patience under suffering. For by these things, and others like them, the body is strengthened and becomes capable of enduring hardship, sturdy and ready for any task. The soul too is strengthened, since it is trained for courage by patience under hardship, and for self-control by abstinence from pleasures. Training which is peculiar to the soul consists first of all in seeing that the proofs pertaining to apparent goods and not being real goods are always ready at hand, and likewise those pertaining to apparent evils as not being real evils, and in learning to recognize the things which are truly good, and in becoming accustomed to distinguish them from what are not truly good. In the next place, it consists of practice in not avoiding any of the things which only seem evil, and in not pursuing any of the things which only seem good, in shunning by every means those which are truly evil, and in pursuing by every means those which are truly good. In summary, then, I have tried to tell what the nature of each type of training is. I shall not, however, endeavour to discuss how the training should be carried out in detail, by analysing and distinguishing what is appropriate for the soul and the body in common and what is appropriate for the soul alone, but by presenting without fixed order what is proper for each. It's true that all of us who have participated in philosophy and discussion have heard and apprehended that neither pain nor death nor poverty nor anything else which is free from wrong is an evil, and again that wealth, life, pleasure, or anything else which does not partake of virtue is not a good. And yet, in spite of understanding this, because of the depravity which has become implanted in us straight from childhood, and because of evil habits engendered by this depravity, when hardship comes, we think an evil has come upon us, and when pleasure comes our way, we think that a good has befallen us. We dread death as the most extreme misfortune. We cling to life as the greatest blessing. And when we give away money, we grieve as if we were injured, but on receiving it we rejoice as if a benefit had been conferred. Similarly, with the majority of other things, we do not meet circumstance in accordance with right principles, but rather we follow wretched habit. Since then, I repeat, all this is the cause. The person who is in training must strive to habituate himself not to love pleasure, not to avoid hardship, not to be infatuated with living, nor to fear death, and in the case of goods or money, not to place receiving above giving. Lecture 7. That one should disdain hardships. In order to support more easily and more cheerfully those hardships which we may expect to suffer in behalf of virtue and goodness, it's useful to recall what hardships people will endure for unworthy ends. Thus, for example, consider what intemperate lovers undergo for the sake of evil desires, and how much exertion others expend for the sake of making profit, and how much suffering those who are pursuing fame endure. And bear in mind that all of these people submit to all kinds of toil and hardship voluntarily. Is it not then monstrous that they for no honourable reward endure such things, while we for the sake of the ideal good, that is, not only the avoidance of evil such as wrecks of our lives, but also the acquisition of virtue, which we may recall the provider of all goods, are not ready to bear every hardship? And yet would not anyone admit how much better it is, in place of exerting oneself to win someone else's wife, to exert oneself to discipline one's desires, in place of enduring hardships for the sake of money, to train oneself to want little, instead of giving oneself trouble about getting notoriety, to give oneself trouble how not to thirst for notoriety, instead of trying to find a way to injure an envied person, to inquire how not to envy anyone, and instead of slaving as sycophants do, to win false friends, to undergo suffering in order to possess true friends. Now, since, in general, toil and hardship are a necessity for all men, both for those who seek the better ends and for those who seek the worst, it is preposterous that those who are pursuing the better are not much more eager in their efforts than those for whom there is small hope of reward for all their pains. Yet when we see acrobats face without concern their difficult tasks, and risk their very lives in performing them, turning somersaults over upturned swords, or walking ropes set at a great height, or flying through the air like birds, where one misstep means death, and all of which they do for a miserably small recompense, shall we not be ready to endure hardship for the sake of complete happiness? For surely there is no other end in becoming good than to become happy and to live happily for the remainder of our lives. One might reasonably reflect upon characteristics even of certain animals, which are very well calculated to shame us into endurance of hardships. At all events, cocks and quails, although they have no understanding of virtue as man has, and know Neither the good nor the just and strive for none of these things. Nevertheless, fight against each other, and even when maimed, stand up and endure until death, so as not to submit the other one to the other. How much more fitting, then, is it that we stand firm and endure when we know that we are suffering for some good purpose, either to help our friends, or to benefit our city, or to defend our wives and children, or best and most imperative, to become good and just and self-controlled, a state which no man achieves without hardships. And so it remains for me to say that the man who is unwilling to exert himself almost always convicts himself as unworthy of good, since we gain every good by toil. These words and others like them he then spoke, exhorting and urging his listeners to look upon hardship with disdain. Lecture 8. That kings should also study philosophy. When one of the kings from Syria once came to him, for at that time there were still kings in Syria, vassals of the Romans, amongst many other things, he had to say to the man were the following words in particular. "Do not imagine," he said, "that it is more appropriate for anyone to study philosophy than you, nor for any other reason than because you are a king. For the first duty of a king is to be able to protect and benefit his people, and a protector and benefactor must know what is good for a man and what is bad, what is helpful and what harmful, what advantageous and what disadvantageous, inasmuch as it is plain that those who ally themselves with evil come to harm, while those who cleave to good enjoy protection, and those who are deemed worthy of help and advantage enjoy benefits, while those who involve themselves in things disadvantageous and harmful suffer punishment. But to distinguish between good and bad, advantageous and disadvantageous, helpful and harmful, is the part of none other than the philosopher, who constantly occupies himself with this very question, how not to be ignorant of any of these things, and has made it his art to understand what conduces to a man's happiness or unhappiness. Therefore it appears that the king should study philosophy. Furthermore, it is fitting for a king, or rather it is an absolute necessity for him, to arbitrate justice as between subjects, so that no one may have more or less than his just deserts, but may receive honour or punishment as he deserves. But how would anyone who has not just ever been able to manage this? And how would anyone ever be just if he did not understand the nature of justice? Here again is a reason the king should study philosophy, for without such study it would not be plain that he knew justice and the just. For one cannot deny either that the one who has learned it will understand justice better than the one who has not learned it, or that all who have not studied philosophy are ignorant of its nature. The truth of this statement appears from the fact that men disagree and contend with one another about justice, some saying that it's here, others that it's there. Yet about things of which men have knowledge there is no difference of opinion, as for example about white and black, or hot and cold, or soft and hard, but all things the same about them, and use the same words. In just the same way they would agree about justice if they knew what it was, but in their very lack of agreement they reveal their ignorance. Indeed, I am inclined to think that you're not far from such ignorance yourself, and you ought therefore, more than anyone else, to concern yourself with this knowledge. The more disgraceful it is for a king than for a private citizen to be ignorant about justice. In the next place, it's essential for the king to exercise self-control over himself and demand self-control of his subjects, to the end that with sober rule and seeming submission there shall be no wantonness on the part of either. For the ruin of the ruler and the citizen alike is wantonness. But how would anyone achieve self-control if he did not make an effort to curb his desires? Or how could one who is undisciplined make others temperate? One can mention no study except philosophy that develops self-control. Certainly it teaches one to be above pleasure and greed, to admire thrift and to avoid extravagance. It trains one to have a sense of shame and to control one's tongue, and it produces discipline, order, and courtesy, and in general what is fitting in action and in bearing. In an ordinary man, when these qualities are present, they give him dignity and self-command. But if they be present in a king, they make him preeminently godlike and worthy of reverence. Now, since fearlessness and intrepidity and boldness are the product of courage, how else would a man acquire them than by having a firm conviction that death and hardships are not evils? For these are the things, death and hardships, I repeat, which unbalance and frighten men when they believe that they are evils. That they are not evils, philosophy is the only teacher. Consequently, if kings ought to possess courage, and they, more than anyone else, should possess it, they must set themselves to the study of philosophy, since they cannot become courageous by any other means. It's also the prerogative of kings, if they enjoy any whatever, to be invincible in reason, and to be able to prevail over disputants by their arguments, just as over their enemies by their arms. Thus, when kings are weak in this, it stands to reason that often they are misled and forced to accept the false as the true, which is the price of folly and dense ignorance. Now, philosophy by its nature confers upon its devotees, perhaps more than anything else, the ability to remain superior to others in debate, to distinguish the false from the true, and to refute the one and to confirm the other. Professional speakers, at any rate, whenever they enter into the give and take of argument with philosophers, one can see confused and confounded and obliged to contradict themselves. And yet if such speakers whose business it is to practice debate are caught because they are inferior to the philosophers in argument, what is bound to happen to other men? Therefore, if it is the ambition of anyone who is a king to be powerful in debate, he should study philosophy in order that he may not have to fear anyone that will prevail over him in this, for a king should be completely fearless and courageous and invincible. In general, it is of the greatest importance for the good king to be faultless and perfect in word and action, if indeed he is to be a living law, as he seemed to the ancients, affecting good government and harmony, suppressing lawlessness and dissension, a true imitator of Gaius, and like him, father of his people. But how could anyone be such a king if he were not endowed with superior nature, given the best possible education, and possessed of all the virtues which befit a man? If, then, there is any other knowledge which guides man's nature to virtue and teaches him to practice and associate with the good, it should be placed beside philosophy and compared with it to see whether it or philosophy is better and more capable of producing a good king. Then the man who wished to become a good king would be wise to use the better one. If, however, no other art professes the teaching and transmission of virtue, though there are some which are concerned solely with man's body and what is useful for it, while others which touch the mind aim at everything else but making it self-controlled, yet philosophy alone makes this its aim, and occupies itself with this, how a man may avoid evil and acquire virtue. If this, I say, is so, what else would be more serviceable to a king who wished to be good than the study of philosophy? How better or how otherwise could a man be a good ruler or live a good life than by studying philosophy? For my part, I believe that the good king is straightway and of necessity a philosopher, and the philosopher a kingly person. One of these two propositions, let us examine the former. Is it possible for anyone to be a good king unless he is a good man? No, it's not possible. But given a good man, would he not be entitled to be called a philosopher? Most certainly, since philosophy is the pursuit of ideal good. Therefore, a good king is found to be forthwith, and of necessity a philosopher also. Now again that the philosopher is entirely kingly, you may understand from this. The attribute of a kingly person is obviously the ability to rule peoples and cities well, and to be worthy to govern men. Well then, who would be more capable head of a city or more worthy to govern men than a philosopher? For it behooves him, if he is truly a philosopher, to be intelligent, disciplined, noble-minded, a good judge of what is just and what is seemly, efficient in putting his plans into effect, patient under hardship. In addition to this, he should be courageous, fearless, resolute in the face of things apparently disastrous, and besides, beneficent, helpful, and humane. Could anyone be found more fit or better able to govern than such a man? No one. Even if he does not have many subjects obedient to him, he is not for that reason less kingly, for it is enough to rule one's friends or one's wife and children, or for that matter, only oneself. For indeed a physician who attends few patients is no less a physician than the one who attends many, if, to be sure, he has skill and experience in healing. In the same way, the musician who teaches only a few pupils is no less a musician than the one who teaches many, provided he knows the art of music. Likewise, the horseman who trains only one or two horses is just as much a horseman as the one who trains many, if he is skilled in horsemanship. And so the title of kingly person belongs to the one who has only one or two subjects, just as well as to the one who has many. Only let him have the skill and ability to rule, so that he may deserve the name of king. For this reason, it seems to me that Socrates too called philosophy that the statesman's like and royal discipline, because one who masters it immediately becomes a statesman. When Musonius said these things, the king was glad at his words, and told him that he was grateful for what he said, and added, in return for this, ask of me whatever you wish for, I shall refuse you nothing. Then Musonius said, the only favour I ask of you is that to remain faithful to this teaching, since you find it commendable, for in this way and no other will you best please me and benefit yourself. Lecture 9. That exile is not an evil. Hearing an exile lament because he was living in banishment, Musonius consoled him somewhat the following way. Why, he asked, should anyone was not devoid of understanding be oppressed by exile? It does not in any way deprive us of water, earth, air, or the sun, and the other planets, or indeed even of the society of men, for everywhere and in every way there is opportunity for association with them. What if we are kept from a certain part of the earth and from association with certain men? What is so dreadful about that? Why, when we were at home, we did not enjoy the whole earth, nor did we have contact with all men. But even now in exile, we may associate with our friends, that is to say, the true ones and those deserving of the name, for they would never betray or abandon us. But if some prove to be sham and not true friends, we're better off separated from them than being with them. Tell me, is not the universe the common fatherland of all men, as Socrates held? Well then, you must not consider it really being banished from your fatherland if you go from where you were born and reared, but only being exiled from a certain city, that is, if you claim to be a reasonable person. For such a man does not value or despise any place as the cause of his happiness or unhappiness, but he makes the whole matter depend upon himself and considers himself a citizen of the god, which is made up of men and gods. Euripides speaks in harmony with this thought when he says, "As all the heavens are open to the eagle's flight, so all the earth is for a noble man his fatherland." Therefore, just as a man who was living in his own country but in a different house from the one where he was born would be thought silly and an object of laughter if he should weep and wail because of this, so whoever considers it a misfortune because he's living in another city and not the one where he happens to have been born would rightly be considered foolish and stupid. Furthermore, how should exile be an obstacle to the cultivation of the things that are one's own and to the acquisition of virtue, when no one was ever hindered from the knowledge and practice of what is needful because of an exile? May it not even be true that exile contributes to that end, since it furnishes men leisure and a greater opportunity for learning the good and practicing it than formerly, in that they are not forced by what only seems to be their fatherland into performing political duties, and they are not annoyed by their kinsmen nor by men who only seem to be their friends, who are skillful in fettering them and dragging them away from the pursuit of better things. In fact, there have been cases where exile was an absolute blessing, as it was to Diogenes, who by his exile was transformed from an ordinary citizen into a philosopher, and instead of sitting idly in Sinope, he busied himself in Greece, and in the pursuit of virtue came to surpass the philosophers. To others who were in poor health as the result of overindulgence and high living, exile has been a source of strength because they were forced to live a more manly life. We even know of some who were cured of chronic ailments in exile, as for instance in our day Spartacus, the Lacedaemonian, who suffered long from a weak chest, and for this reason was often ill from high living. But when he stopped living a life of luxury, he ceased to be ill. They say that others addicted to high living have got rid of gout, although they were previously completely bedridden by the disease. People whom exile compelled to become accustomed to living more simply, and by this very thing were brought back to health. Thus it appears that by treating them better than they treat themselves, exile helps rather than hinders health of body and of spirit. It's not true, moreover, that exiles lack the very necessities of life. To be sure, men who are idle and unresourceful and unable to play the part of a man are generally in want and without resources, even when they're in their own country. But energetic and hard-working and intelligent men, no matter where they go, fare well and live without want. We do not feel the lack of many things unless we wish to live luxuriously. For what do mortals need besides two things only? The bread of Demeter and a drink of the water carrier, which are at hand and have been made to nourish us. Let me add that men who are worth anything not only easily manage so well so far as the necessities of life are concerned when they are in exile, but of 10 acquire great fortunes. At any rate, Odysseus in worse plight than any exile, one may say, since he was alone and naked and shipwrecked when he arrived among strangers. The Phaeacians was nevertheless able to enrich himself abundantly. And when Themistocles was banished from home, going to people who were not only friendly but actual enemies and barbarians, the Persians, he received a gift of 3 cities, Myus, Magnesia, and Lampsacus, as a source of livelihood. Dio of Syracuse, too, deprived by Dionysius, the tyrant, of all his possessions, when he was banished from his country, waxed so rich in exile that he raised a mercenary army, went with it to Sicily, and freed the island of the tyrant. Who then, if he were in his right mind, looking at these cases, would still maintain that banishment is the cause of want for all exiles? Furthermore, It's not at all necessary for exiles to suffer ill repute because of their banishment, since everyone knows that many trials are badly judged, and many people are unjustly banished from their country, and that in the past there have been cases of good men who have been exiled by their countrymen, as for example from Athens, Aristides the Just, and from Epictetus Hermodorus, because of whose banishment Heraclitus bade the Ephesians, every grown man of them, go hang themselves. In fact, some exiles even became very famous, as Diogenes of Sinope and Clearhorse, the Lacedaemonian, who with Cyrus marched against Artaxerxes, not to mention more. How, pray, could this condition, in which some people have become more renowned than before, be responsible for ill repute? But you insist. Euripides says that exiles lose their personal liberty when they're deprived of their freedom of speech. For he represents Jocasta asking Panaetius, her son, what misfortunes an exile has to bear. He answers, one greatest of all, that he has not freedom of speech. She replies, but you name the plight of a slave, not to be able to say what one thinks. But I should say in rejoinder, you are right, Euripides, when you say that it's the condition of a slave not to say what one thinks when one ought to speak, for it is not always, nor everywhere, nor before everyone that we should say what we think. But at one point, it seems to me, is not well taken that exiles do not have freedom of speech. If to you freedom of speech means not suppressing whatever one chances to think. For it's not as exiles that men fear to speak what they think, but as men afraid lest from speaking pain or death or punishment or some other thing shall befall them. Fear is the cause of this, not exile. For to many people, nay to most, even though dwelling safely in their native city, fear of what seem to them dire consequences of free speech is present. However, the courageous man in exile, no less than at home, is dauntless in the face of all such fears. For that reason, he also has the courage to say what he thinks equally at home or in exile. Such are the things one might reply to Euripides. But tell me, my friend, when Diogenes was in exile at Athens, or when he was sold by pirates and came to Corinth, did anyone, Athenian or Corinthian, ever exhibit greater freedom of speech than he? And again, were any of his contemporaries freer than Diogenes? Why, even Exanides, who brought him, he rules as a master rules a slave. But why should I employ examples of long ago? Are you not aware that I am an exile? Well, then I have been deprived of freedom of speech. Have I been bereft of the privilege of saying what I think? Have you or anyone else ever seen me cringing before anyone just because I'm an exile, or thinking that my lot is worse now than formerly? No. I'll wager that you would say that you've never seen me complaining or disheartened because of my banishment. For if I have been deprived of my country, I've not been deprived of my ability to endure exile. The reflections which I employ for my own benefit, so as not to be irked by exile, I should like to repeat to you. It seems to me that exile does not strip a man entirely, not even of the things which the average man calls goods, as I've just shown. But if he is deprived of some or all of them, he is still not deprived of the things which are truly goods. Certainly the exile is not prevented from possessing courage and justice, simply because he is banished, nor self-control, nor understanding, nor any of the other virtues which, when present, serve to bring honour and benefit to a man, and show him to be praiseworthy and of good repute, but when absent, serve to cause him harm and dishonour, and show him to be wicked and of ill repute. Since this is true, if you are that good man and have his virtues, exile will not harm or degrade you, because the virtues are present in you, which are most able to help and to sustain you. But if you're bad, it's the evil that harms you and not exile. And the misery you feel in exile is the product of evil, not of exile. It's from this you must hasten to secure release rather than from exile. These things I used to repeat to myself, and I say them to you now. If you are wise, you will not consider that exile is a thing to be dreaded, since others bear it easily, but evil. It makes wretched every man in whom it's present, and neither of the two necessary alternatives is just cause for repining. For either you were banished justly or unjustly. If justly, how can it be right or fitting to feel aggrieved at just punishment? If unjustly, the evil involved is not ours, but falls upon those who banished us. If in fact you agree that doing a wrong, as they have done, is the most hateful thing in the world, while suffering a wrong, as has been our fate in the eyes of the gods and of just men, is held aground not for hate, but for help. Lecture 10. Will the philosopher prosecute anyone for personal injury? He said that he himself would never prosecute anyone for personal injury, nor recommend it to anyone else who claimed to be a philosopher. For actually none of the things which people fancy they suffer as personal injuries, or an injury or a disgrace to those who experience them, such as being reviled or struck or spit upon. Of these, the hardest to bear are blows. That there is nothing shameful or insulting about them, however, is clear from the fact that Lacedaemonian boys are whipped publicly and they exult in it. If then the philosopher cannot despise blows and insults, when he ought obviously to despise even death, what good would he be? Well and good, you say, but the spirit of the man who does such things is monstrous, executing his purpose to insult by jeering and a slap in the face, or by abusive language, or by some other action. You know, of course, that Demosthenes holds that people who can insult, even by a glance, and that such things are intolerable, and that men in one way or another are driven mad by them. So it is that men who do not know what is really good and what is shameful, having regard for only common opinion, think they are insulted if someone gives them a malignant glance, or laughs or strikes them, or reviles them. But the wise and sensible man, such as the philosopher ought to be, is not disturbed by any of these things. He does not think that disgrace lies in enduring them, but rather than in doing them. For what does the man who submits to insult do that is wrong? It is the doer of wrong who forthwith puts himself to shame, while the sufferer, who does nothing but submit, has no reason whatever to feel shame or disgrace. Therefore the sensible man would not go to law nor bring indictments, since he would not even consider that he had been insulted. Besides, to be annoyed or racked about such things would be petty. Rather, he will easily and silently bear what has happened, since this befits one whose purpose is to be noble-minded. Socrates, you remember, was clearly of this frame of mind, who though publicly ridiculed by Aristophanes, was not angry, but when he happened to meet him, asked him if he would like to use him for some other role. Can't you imagine how quickly he would have flared up in anger at some petty abuse, this man who showed no concern even when abused in the public theatre? And the good Phocion, when his wife had been reviled by someone, so far from prosecuting the fellow when he came in fear and asked for forgiveness of Phocion, saying that he did not know it was his wife whom he had offended, merely replied, "But my wife has suffered nothing at your hands, though perhaps some other woman has, so you have no need to apologize to me." And I might mention many other men who have experienced insult, some wronged by word, others by violence and bodily harm, who do not appear to have defended their rights against their assailants, nor to have proceeded against them in any other way, but very meekly bore their wrong. And in this they were quite right. For to scheme how to bite back the biter, and to return evil for evil, is the act not of a human being, but of a wild beast, which is incapable of reasoning that the majority of wrongs are done to men through ignorance and misunderstanding, from which man will cease as soon as he has been taught. But to accept injury not in a spirit of savage resentment, and to show ourselves not implacable towards those who wrong us, but rather to be a source of good hope to them, is characteristic of a benevolent and civilized way of life. How much better a figure does the philosopher make, so conducting himself as to deem worthy of forgiveness anyone who wrongs him, than to behave as if ready to defend himself with legal procedure and indictments, while in reality he is behaving in an unseemly manner and acting quite contrary to his own teaching. To be sure, he says that a good man can never be wronged by a bad man, but nevertheless he draws up an indictment as having been wronged by bad men, while claiming to be accounted a good man himself.